Dr. Joshi, the distinguished Vice Chancellor, Mrs. Mitra, the family members of Dr. Mitra, faculty members, many distinguished guests sitting in the audience, and I see very senior colleagues here, particularly Mr. D.S. Mishra, who's been both Secretary Urban Development and Chief Secretary UP, and whose contribution is very legendary, and all the dear students who've joined here, and I also see some parents. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm particularly delighted to be here in the midst of all of you, particularly a lot of young faces. And let me at the outset compliment Dr. Joshi and the IIFT for starting this lecture in memory of Dr. Mitra, Dr. Mitra was an academic genius. He was a brilliant man who was always a gold medalist, a topper. But more than that, he was a brilliant speaker, a great academician, an intellectual par excellence, and he became one of the most popular lecturers and ended up being the registrar of the Indian Institute of Foreign Trade, and was a very popular personality whose contribution both in the government of India and in the academic institution has left a huge imprint, particularly on the minds of young students. So my compliments to Dr. Joshi, and I'm glad that this MOU for an annual lecture has now been exchanged, so we will have a continuous dialogue in the memory of Dr. Mitra. Ladies and gentlemen, the topic given to me is India's emergence as global trade and economic power. When in around 1700, when the British really took over India and made it a colony, India's share in global GDP was close to about 35%, around 35% of the global GDP. By the time the Britishers left India in 1947, India's share in global GDP had come down to a mere 4.5%. So from about 35% to 4.5% of the global GDP, India's share had come down. And India had been reduced from being a major global trade player and a major contributor to global GDP. It had been brought to the periphery of the global trade by the British Empire. The Indian economy was subservient to the British economy, and the Britishers ensured that India only produced raw materials which became an input into the many materials which the British economy produced. And therefore, permanent damage was done to the Indian economy over the period of time. The British Raj was then replaced by the license Raj. And we saw the tentacles of government spread all over the Indian economy. And even to produce goods, licenses were given, and if you produce more than the quantity for which you were licensed, you were penalized, and at one point of time, you could go to jail for producing more. That was the extent of the control of the socialist economy. The first wave of reform came in 1991. Those were industrial reforms, and the industrial delicensing took place. But structural reforms remained. And many of you would recall that about a decade back, India was amongst the fragile five economies of the world. The fragile five economies of the world, and there was a twin balance sheet problem with huge debts on the corporate balance sheet of the large corporates of India and non-performing assets on the balance sheet of the financial institutions, the banks who had provided loans and were not being repaid. And then, therefore, the balance sheet of both the financial institutions and of the large corporates had been impacted very severely. But within a decade, India has moved from being in the top, from the fragile five to the top five, and is now the fourth largest economy in the world. In another 3 years, 2.5 years, we should overtake Germany to be the third largest economy in the world. So first and foremost, what have we done to move from fragile five to the top four? Firstly, I think there have been major structural reforms in the economy. And I'm saying this because trade is a function of global growth. It's a function of India's growth story, and I'll come to exports a little later. But for India, which grew last year at about 8.2%, this year will grow at about 7%, is the fastest growing large economy. But what has it done in the last decade? Firstly, the structural reforms. The goods and services tax, which has replaced about 28 taxes and 18 cesses. Many of you would recall that at the state boundaries there used to be large lines of lorries lined up for octroi payments, etc. All that has vanished. It's a paperless, cashless tax, and we've seen buoyancy of tax growth month after month. Secondly, there was no financial discipline in India's economy, and there was no way that a company could be started, but there's no way to make a company die if it was a non-performing company. And therefore, the insolvency bankruptcy code came in, which has brought a huge credit discipline. And companies, therefore, have started paying to the financial institutions where they borrow, and a huge amount of credit discipline has come into India's economy. The third has been the Real Estate Regulation Act, which has been driven by Mr. Mishra, who's sitting here when he was Secretary of Urban Development. The Real Estate Regulation Act has made a huge difference. Many of you who come from middle-class families used to book houses, never get them. But now a due diligence is done and a prior permission is given by the real estate regulator, and therefore middle-class people get their houses, and actually this discipline has led to a huge amount of growth and buoyancy in the real estate sector. Fourthly, the government laid a lot of focus on ease of doing business and has scrapped a number of rules, regulations, procedures and acts. India jumped up 79 positions in the World Bank Ease of Doing Business. Is the only country in the world which has scrapped close to about 1,700 laws. And through the Jan Vishwas bill, it has decriminalized a lot of regulations in India. And therefore, the objective of the government has been that the government should act as a facilitator and a catalyst and allow the private sector to grow. So these have been the major structural reforms in the Indian economy. The second big story of India has been the digital story of India. We are the only country in the world with 1.4 billion digital identity. Every Indian has an identity. And then between 2015 and 2017, we opened 550 million bank accounts. Every second bank account opened in the world was opened in India. 55% of the bank accounts opened in the world were opened in India. At that point of time, only 18% of the women had a bank account. Today, 91% of the women have a bank account. So this has led to inclusive growth. But then the bank accounts were seeded with both the Aadhaar number and the mobile number. And that led to Indians doing fast payments. And many of you, and most of you, today use the UPI to do fast payments from your mobile. You don't use your debit credit card, you don't go to a physical bank, you don't use your credit card, but you use the UPI to do payments. So India today does about 50% of the real-time fast payments in the world. China is next with about 20%, and in the last month we've done about 586 billion worth of fast payments. And then you saw a number of young startups, MobiKwik, Pine Lab, etc., who looked at the history of fast payments and started providing credit to people. So vegetable vendors, poor people living below the poverty line, credit was provided based on the payment history. And one of the big things that has happened is that street vendors who've been provided assistance and support have all been made to go digital in India. And then from credit, we saw a number of young startups like Zerodha, Grow Upstock, who took wealth creation and stock market to Tier 2, Tier 3 cities and rural areas. These are all young startups. And therefore, today a stock market transaction can be done from the mobile within 30 seconds. And then we had a number of startups like GoDigit and Acco who could provide insurance, any kind of insurance, on the mobile, on the go. When I was a young officer and I had to take a policy of LIC, it used to take me 6 to 7 months of paperwork to get a policy. Today you can do everything from fast payment, from identity to fast payment, to credit, to stock market transaction, wealth creation, to insurance. All that India does from 30 seconds to 1 minute on the mobile, on the go. You can be anywhere on the mobile, you'll do this transaction and you can buy an insurance policy, or you can do a stock market transaction, or you can take credit. All this happens on the mobile, on the go. This does not happen anywhere else in the world. So if you look at the western part of the world, in the last 3 decades, all technological innovations have been driven by Google, Amazon, Meta. These have been the big drivers of growth. And in China, Tencent and Alibaba have driven growth. But all these are proprietary closed model. When you get onto Google or you get onto Meta, your data is owned by them and then they use your data to do artificial intelligence and machine learning. But India built up a very different model. It built up a model where we created the digital public identity layer and then allowed private sector to compete and innovate. So India is the only country where PhonePe competes with Google Pay, Paytm competes with Amazon Pay, because the model is open source, open API, globally interoperable model. And this model demonstrated that during COVID we could do 2.2 billion COVID vaccination, which was paperless and cashless. And during COVID we could provide over 500 million people benefits straight into their bank accounts, particularly the women, straight into their bank account without any leakage. And in Government of India, 700 schemes, we provide money straight into the bank accounts of beneficiaries without any leakage. During COVID, in America, they issued checks and 18% of the checks came back. Germany struggled, France struggled, but India could put money straight into the bank accounts of beneficiaries. And therefore, India is technologically leapfrogged, pole vaulted. And that's why the Bank of International Settlements said that India did in 7 years what it would have taken India 50 years to achieve. 7 years what it would have taken 50 years to achieve. That is the technological story of India, and as the World Bank says, that the cost of acquisition of a customer has fallen in India. Paperwork, etc., used to cost about $35 to $40 per customer. It has come down to less than 15 cents in India, and that is why a company like Reliance Jio, when it started taking customers, could acquire over 500 million customers in less than 7 months' time, because the cost of acquisition of a customer had fallen in India. So the real big story of India has been the digital story of India, and this model is now being taken to the global south. So I spoke about structural reforms, I spoke about digitization, and the third big story of India has been the infrastructure creation of India. So in the last 8 years, India has built about 40 million houses. And 40 million houses, and it's going to build another 30 million houses in the next 3 to 4 years. But 40 million houses, people do not realize, is like making a complete Australia within India, because 40 million houses is more than the population of Australia. We've built over 120 million toilets and brought behavioral change, which is like making a toilet for every citizen of Germany. That's more than the population of Germany. That is the size and scale of what India does, because when we sit in India, we do not realize this, but we've provided piped water connection to 253 million Indians. 253 million Indians, piped water connection means more than the population of Brazil. That's the size and scale of what we've done. We've also provided electricity connection to 30 million Indians. That is a remarkable story, and we've built over 77,000 kilometers of roads, which is 4 times more roads than what India had 8 years back. So the story of house, electricity, piped water connection, toilets, roads is a major story of India in terms of infrastructure creation, and the capex spend of India has moved up from less than 1% to close to 4% of India's GDP. And that has really driven the growth story of India. That is a big story of India. So the infrastructure story has been the third big story of India. And the fourth story of India has been the story of how it has gone green. So India is the only country which has actually lived up to its commitment of COP21 at Paris and has built up close to 225, now about close to 230 gigawatt of non-fossil energy. Now, our target is that by 2030 we'll achieve 500 gigawatt of renewable energy, and 500 gigawatt of renewable energy, we've also brought down the cost of power from about 24 rupees to less than 2 rupees through transparent bidding process and good policies. We've also provided 130 million of our women who used to cook food on firewood, we've given them LPG connections. So we've changed the lives of women, because when they were cooking on firewood, it used to impact their nutrition, health, hygiene, everything, and it used to impact hugely their living conditions. We've substituted all that with LPG connection. And when I was in Niti Aayog, we procured 8,000 electric buses by pooling the demand of 7 cities. The next Prime Minister said that the next tender will be of 10,000 buses, the third tender will be of 30,000 electric buses, and the fourth tender will be of 100,000 electric buses. So when you do that scale, it's like when we procured 570 million LED bulbs for India, the cost of LED bulbs fell down to 15% of their original price, because we used the size and scale of India, and same thing we are doing for electric buses. So what we've demonstrated is that if you are able to pool the demand and procure commodities, not only will you manufacture in India, but you'll bring down the prices, and you can use the size and scale of India to drive growth. And therefore, what we've demonstrated, that net zero is net positive in India, and that India can actually be the first country in the world to industrialize and urbanize through a process of decarbonization. So going green, using the size and scale of India, and actually driving sustainability has been a big story of India, and that, to my mind, is the fourth pillar. It's not a much talked about story, but it's a very important story of India. And the fifth is that if you have to grow at high rates, which is the challenge for India, and really the challenge for India is that it's a $4 trillion economy. But its aim, as the Prime Minister said, is that you have to become a Viksit Bharat by 2047, means that you have to move from 4 trillion to becoming a $30+ trillion economy. From 4 trillion to a $30+ trillion economy means that your GDP has to grow 9 times, your per capita income has to grow 8 times, your manufacturing has to grow 16 times. Very few countries in the world have been able to do it. It was done by Japan in the post-World War II period, when it grew at about 9.6% for a period of 2 decades. Later it was done by Korea, then it was done, in recent times it has been done by China, which has grown at a scorching pace of 10.2% for over 3 decades. But all other countries got caught in the middle income trap. There are 108 countries of the world who are caught in a middle income trap. And the challenge for India, therefore, is that it should grow at rates of 9 to 10% per annum, year after year, year after year, year after year. And only when you grow at that rate, the compounding power of growth will enable you to become a $30+ trillion economy, and that is important. And for that to be able to do that, no country has been able to do it without using technology and getting into emerging areas of growth. So India, therefore, has launched the artificial intelligence mission, where it is providing computing power to its students and researchers at almost half the cost at which it is available across the world for leading computing power for AI. It is supported about 4 different foundational models, so that we build up foundational models which can then capture India's history, civilization, our strength. Otherwise, all that will get lost to the western part of the world or the Chinese part of the world. And we launched the quantum computing mission, the semiconductor mission, and a green hydrogen mission, which aims to use renewable energy to crack water and produce green hydrogen, so that by 2047 India becomes the cheapest producer of clean energy and green hydrogen, and becomes the biggest producer and exporter of green hydrogen to the rest of the world. So the fifth story of India has been the story of using technology to leapfrog, which is very, very important. Without this, India will never be able to grow at high rates and will never be able to become a $30+ trillion economy. But ladies and gentlemen, there are various challenges also which India faces, and it's important to understand this. First and foremost, when these countries were growing, when Japan was growing, when Korea was growing, when China was growing, there was a relative period of stability across the world. There was a period of stability because the institution constituted in the post-92nd World War period, there was the United Nations, there was a stable period of World Bank, IMF, etc. The international institutions were relevant, and they had brought in global stability. The big power, the Security Council worked, and there was a relative period of stability. But now, as India continues to grow and aims to be a $30+ trillion economy, the global challenge is that there is a war in Europe, in the heart of Europe, for last 3.5 decades. The First World War was fought in Europe, the Second World War was fought in Europe, and that you are seeing a war in Europe for the last 3.5, 4 years, and there's a major war on in the Middle East. For over 450,000 people have died in the Middle East, and you're seeing today a big bust of bombs being dropped in the heart of Iran. So you're seeing a major conflicts taking place. You're seeing a conflict in Europe, you're seeing a conflict in Middle East, you're seeing that China is saying that we will annex Taiwan even if it requires use of force because of our one China policy. So you will see tensions in Asia. And therefore, the period of stability in globalization has come to an end. The second is that global value chain. When these countries were growing, they used exports as a major vehicle of growth, and exports brought in prosperity. Exports became a very big driver of growth. And that lifted vast segments of population because there was free trade. The period of free trade has ended, and you've seen both the Biden administration and the Trump administration levying huge duties on China, and China levying duties on them, and now the Trump administration levying duties on 60 countries of the world and saying that we don't believe in the WTO, and the making WTO, which is a part which has over the years negotiated in a multilateral manner, making it the distinction between developed, developing, and the less developed countries has been lost, with Donald Trump saying that I'll negotiate directly with the rest of the world, with 60 countries. And therefore, he is attempting to take over the role of the WTO and substituting multilateralism with American trade negotiations. Important thing for all of us to understand is that America accounts for only 13% of the global trade, only 13%. But the rest of the 87% is not able to arrive at a consensus because China becomes a major player and the rest of the world doesn't trust China. And therefore, it is important for us to understand that the global supply chains are disrupted, trade is impacted, there's lack of predictability, there's lack of consistencies, and there's a lack of belief that trade will lift people above the poverty line, because Trump says that free trade has adversely impacted the United States of America. But in reality, all of us must know that there is only one country in the world which accounts for 26% of the global GDP, which accounts for over 48% of the market capitalization, and accounts for over, 48% of the market capitalization, 26% of the global GDP, with just 4% of the population. With just 4% of the global population, America accounts for 48% of the market cap, 26% of the GDP, and therefore if any country has benefited out of free trade, it's the United States of America. The European share came down from 30% to less than 17%, and America remains stable. And therefore, it became a post-industrial society which grew on the back of innovation. And therefore, the big change will be that unlike other countries, unlike Japan, Korea, China, we will be confronted with major challenges. The third key force, which is important, is that there are new forces of production and productivity. There's artificial intelligence, there's robotics, there's quantum computing, the machine learning. All these are new forces of production which have the potential to transform lives of citizens, enhance learning outcomes, health outcomes. They will transform lives, productivity will improve. There will be radical improvements because of new technology. But the basic assumption on which they are based need a consensus, because the algorithms can also trigger conflict among societies. And therefore, much like nuclear energy and atomic energy, you will require some kind of a consensus. So these are new forces, these are the global challenges. There are domestic challenges for India. Firstly, that we grew at 8.2%, we'll grow at 7%, we must understand that we achieved this growth with just 50% of our population. The other 50% of our population are either wage earners in agriculture sector, where 46% of our population is dependent on agriculture. Actually, post-COVID, the number has gone up from 41 to 46%, or others live on government subsidies and doles. So the government attempt has been to make this passive 50% of our population as active participants in India's economy, by giving them mudra loans, by giving them this street vendor loans, by digitizing them and making them very active participants in our economy. And once they become active participants, India will consistently grow for a long period of time. That's the number one challenge. Make people active participants in India's economy. And second, that it will not be possible for India to grow without exports. But for exports to happen, you need large-scale manufacturing. You need size and scale of manufacturing. And for size and scale of manufacturing, you need the factors of production right. You need land, you need labor, you need lower interest rates, you need electricity to be given at globally international prices. And that is important. And therefore, the size and scale of manufacturing is important, and exports are important. Every time India has grown at high rates, it's grown on the back of exports. During the 2003-2008 periods, that was a high growth period. The world trade grew at 16%, but Indian exports grew at 22%. And that's why India grew. And therefore, if you look at the financial year 25, exports are estimated at 21.2% of our GDP. Imports are 23.5% of our GDP. This roughly gives us a trade deficit of 2% of our GDP. And it's very, very important that in this environment of trade wars, tariffs, uncertainty, we need to open up new markets. And we need to push for our exports. This will be very critical. So first is that make 50% active participants. Secondly, do large-scale manufacturing, exports, penetrate new markets. That's important. And the third very important thing I would point out is urbanization. Because India will see a rapid period of urbanization. We will see 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization in the next 5 decades. Now, 500 million people getting into the process of urbanization means that you'll have to create 2.5 Americas. And we need to do this in a sustainable manner. We need to plan our cities. 15 of our cities account for about 35% of India's GDP, the top 15 cities. So if India has to grow, these cities need to be better managed, more sustainable. They need to be better managed in terms of water, in terms of their waste, in terms of recycling the waste, in terms of drainage, sewage, solid waste, and in terms of public transportation, on the back of which new urbanization must take place. And therefore, urbanization will be a very critical driver. And last and foremost, that it's very, very important that we are able to improve our learning outcomes, our health outcomes, our nutritional standards, because no country in the world has grown without physical quality of life index and human development index. And that is very important, particularly for the eastern part of India, because India has grown largely in the southern part of India, the western part of India, the northern part of India. But the eastern part of India needs to grow rapidly. And therefore, you need 12 champion states in India who will grow at 10% plus for India to grow at 9 to 10%. That's very important. We have only 1,000 large companies today in India. We need 10,000 large companies because they will create the backward-forward linkage with MSMEs. When Maruti came in, it brought in Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 producers who then supplied to Maruti. And therefore, you need large companies which will create their own systems of backward-forward linkages. And then all this, because all of you learn trade, let me tell you that trade will be a very defining feature. The cumulative value of our merchandise exports during financial year 25 was US $437 billion, and it grew at just 0.8 over financial year 24. I'm saying this because it's important to understand that our total imports from China, if you look at batteries, if you look at solar energies components, if you look at wind energy, is over 110 billion. Our exports to China is very minimal. We export even less than what Ireland does. Ireland is less than the city of Delhi. That's the size. They export more than what India does to China. And therefore, each of these items which we import from China needs to be broken down and manufactured here. Because we are in an environment where there will be trade wars, there will be tariffs, there will be uncertainty, but it's very, very important to open new markets, particularly the Asian markets. Now, trade agreements are an important step in opening up new markets and growing exports. Recently, we concluded an important trade agreement with the UK. In recent years, we've concluded trade agreements with Australia, the UAE, and some of the Nordic countries. Negotiations with US and Europe are underway, and negotiations are also underway with countries rich in critical minerals such as Chile and Peru. But export competitiveness is not just about tariff and trade agreements. It is also about building domestic capabilities to be able to compete in global markets. And therefore, ease of doing business, infrastructure, access to credit are factors that we have to address domestically. Because we've all grown up with the license Raj period, all of us have a very socialistic and leftist mindset, and it's very important to break all these rules, regulations, procedures, acts, so that we allow free enterprise to grow in India. Without free enterprise, India will never grow at high rates. It will not be possible. Many of you are young people, and when you're young, it's important to have a leftist frame of mind. But if you want India to grow at high rates over a period of time, all these rules and regulations need to be scrapped to make India grow. And it's very important to do this. Because we must reduce the cost of doing business, the cost of logistics, the cost of credit, and that alone will improve our competitiveness and enable us to become an exporting nation. Ladies and gentlemen, it's important to understand that India is in the midst of radical changes. The world is in the midst of a crisis of globalization, crisis of supply chains, crisis of new technology. But having said all these challenges of globalization and given you the challenges of within India, I'm a great believer in India. I'm extremely optimistic that this is not merely India's decade, but this is India's century. And this is India's century because this is a very young India. Our demographics are very young. Our average age is just 29. Even when we become 100, our average age will be 35. America is aging, Europe is aging, China is aging, India is still very young, and rarely has a country not created wealth when it is young. And therefore, this young India is bound to rise and grow because there are low dependency burdens. Secondly, there's no country in the world which is making 8 metros, 8 airports and 3 metros every year. 8 airports and 3 metros every year. There's no country which is doing 30 kilometers of roads and 12 kilometers of railway lines every year. And there is no country in the world which has grown its solar energy about 11x in the last 8 years. And there's no country which does 50% of the real-time fast payment in the world. I'm therefore a great believer in India, and my belief is that when India grows rapidly, does disruption of the kind we've done in digital public infrastructure, then we are not merely transforming the lives of 1.4 billion Indians, but of the 4.5 billion people who will move from poverty to middle class in the days to come. And exports will be a major driver in that, and the students from IIFT will be a major driver in this process of India driving and becoming a $30+ trillion economy by 2047. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. I'm truly delighted to pay homage to Dr. Mitra and to have delivered the first lecture in memory of Dr. Mitra. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shri Kant, for an absolutely stunningly brilliant an insightful talk.